Section 15 of When Railroads Were New by Charles Frederick Carter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ted Lienhart. Chapter 7, The First Transcontinental Railroad, Part 2. Those who could find no leverage by which to extort money busied themselves with criticizing financial and engineering methods and everything else connected with the project. It seemed as if there were as many foes in the rear as at the front. Besides all this, the physical obstacles to be overcome were immense. Omaha, for all practical purposes, was almost as inaccessible as San Francisco. The nearest railroad was the Northwestern, 150 miles to the east, and in no hurry to reach Omaha. Every pound of supplies had to be brought overland by wagon or up the Missouri River in steamboats. As a sample of the expense of railroad building under these circumstances, it may be mentioned that ties cost $2.50 each when they were finally in place. The workmen had so little confidence in the solvency of the concern that they demanded and received their day's pay before beginning work, while the white men, who had been so ready to applaud the abstract idea of a transcontinental railroad and so reluctant to facilitate its realization, were giving the Union Pacific so much trouble. The Indians rendered the company an invaluable service. This they achieved through an earnest effort to lift the scalps of General G.M. Dodge and his escort. In the winter of 1864-65, the Indians had declared war by way of varying the steady round of unofficial outrages which had begun to pall upon them. General Dodge, who had made the survey for the Rock Island in 1853, was sent out to conduct the campaign against them. Repeated efforts had failed to reveal a pass by which the road could be taken over the mountain range in southern Wyoming. General Dodge, being keenly interested in the Union Pacific survey, took advantage of every opportunity to pick up topographical points. One day the general took an escort of 6 cavalrymen and, arranging to meet the main body of troops at a certain point, set out to have a look at the country. About noon he discovered a large body of Indians trying to corral him and his escort. Being a good Indian fighter, he rode hard for the nearest ridge, where there was no cover to enable the scalp hunters to stalk him, and started along its crest toward his command, stopping occasionally to beat off the Indians whenever they became too eager. After a long ride, the little party reached the main body of the troops. The ridge upon which the Indians had herded them all afternoon had led them down a gentle slope without a break to the plain. The pass through the mountains had been found. 1 year later, General Dodge returned to the spot where the ridge blended into the plains and laid out the city of Cheyenne, Wyoming. While he was at work, the Indians raided a party of Mormon immigrants on the trail over which the general had just passed and killed a couple of men, thus enabling the cemetery of the new town to be started without delay. By the beginning of 1867, the Union Pacific was in operation to a point 305 miles west of Omaha. The completion of the Northwestern to Omaha in December 1866 opened up a line of communication which very greatly reduced the cost of supplies. The Union Pacific being now extended to a point most convenient for the Indians, all the tribes of the plains united their forces for the avowed purpose of exterminating the whites. 15,000 warriors took the field, devoting especial attention to the railroad. Everything had to be done under armed guard. The engineers laid out the line within musket range of a strong military escort, dividing their attention between their instruments and their rifles. Even then, numbers of them were killed and their stock run off by thousands. One party of 10 men was jumped by Indians in Wyoming. Not being skilled in Indian fighting, they did the worst thing they possibly could have done. They undertook to conceal themselves in a clump of sagebrush some 500 feet in diameter, which was commanded by a little bluff at a distance of 200 yards. The sagebrush afforded no protection and simply provided a cover under which the Indians could creep up on them without risk of being seen. Whenever a white man moved or made a sound, a volley of bullets would come in his direction. When darkness came, 3 white men, the only ones left alive, crept from that sagebrush and contrived to reach safety. Not satisfied with murder and robbery, the Indians pulled up the surveyor's stakes and destroyed them, so that much of the work had to be done over. At first, the Indians had not known what to make of the locomotive, but soon they gathered courage to try to stop a train by stretching a lariat across the track, held by 30 braves on each side. After it was all over, the red man had a new grievance against his pale-faced oppressor, which he sought to redress in the usual way. A station near the scene of the disastrous holdup was raided next evening. One man was caught before he could reach the shelter of the building. Him the Indians took to a little depression, where they would be out of range of the guns of the few men in the station, staked him out on the ground, built a small fire on his breast, and then gathered about it to warm themselves and enjoy the agonies of the victim. His cries could be heard by the men in the station for several hours, but they dared not venture out in the darkness to attempt a rescue. The Indians soon learned how to wreck trains. One night in the summer of 1867, they placed an obstruction on the track near Plum Creek, Nebraska, and ditched a freight train. The engineer, fireman, head brakeman, and conductor were killed. The hind man, named Johnson, was shot in the back. The bullet knocked him down, but did not render him unconscious. He had presence of mind enough not to utter a sound or move a muscle, even when an Indian seated himself astride his body and with an extremely dull knife proceeded with great deliberation to scalp him. This operation completed to the Indian's entire satisfaction. He stripped Johnson of everything but shirt and shoes and left him. Next morning, another train was flagged about a mile from the scene of the wreck by a hideous object, which, upon examination, proved to be Johnson, covered from crown to sole with blood and dirt. His scalp was found where it had been dropped by the Indian in the excitement of plundering the train, but it wouldn't grow on again, although an obliging surgeon gave it every encouragement. On another occasion, the Indians made the unfortunate mistake of sacking a train when General Dodge was close at hand. The general was on his way back from the front one day when he was notified at Plum Creek, 200 miles west of Omaha, that the Indians had captured a freight train a few miles east of the station. Dodge's private car was merely an arsenal on wheels, with enough space left for a berth and a table, which served alternately as a dining table and a desk. On the train were some 20 men who had had enough of railroad construction on a war footing and were bound for civilization. On hearing of the capture of the train, General Dodge immediately called for volunteers to help punish the Indians. Every man on the train immediately fell into ranks like veterans, as indeed they were. The engine was coupled onto the private car. The volunteers hastily climbed aboard, and as the engineer coaxed the utmost possible speed out of his machine, they were given arms and instructions. So quickly was the scene of the wreck reached that the Indians were still busy with the plunder without a thought of danger. In perfect order, the volunteers sprang to the ground and deployed. So brilliantly was the maneuver executed that few of the red wreckers escaped. At Sedgwick, the Indians made an exceptionally successful raid, capturing the entire outfits of 2 subcontractors and killing such a large number of men that the survivors fled to civilization. It was only after a considerable difficulty that others were induced to take their places. The construction gangs fought off Indians with one hand and wielded pick and shovel with the other. No one will ever know how many men were killed by Indians in the building of the Union Pacific. Vice President Durant didn't like to have such things made public. The only settlements west of the Missouri, with the exception of Denver and a few other mining camps in Colorado and Nevada, were those of the Mormons in the vicinity of Great Salt Lake. Ogden was a village of a few hundred inhabitants. An exception might be made to this statement if the community of something like 3,000 inhabitants living in tents and shacks at the end of the track could be called a settlement. As fast as the road was finished to a convenient point, it was operated to that point, which then became temporary headquarters from which the work of construction was managed. The town always moved with headquarters, and so came to be known as Hell on Wheels, and the title was appropriate. Aside from the railroad employees and a few storekeepers, The population consisted chiefly of gamblers and desperados and the very worst class of women. The chief article of commerce was vile whiskey, and the principal industry was robbery, either thinly disguised as gambling or by more elementary methods whenever convenient. Only by the frequent application of lynch law were the murders kept down to an average of one a day the greater part of the time. There was a ceaseless orgy of the lowest debauchery and the grossest crime in this hell on wheels that has left a stigma which will last as long as the Union Pacific itself. That such shameful conditions are not necessarily a part of railroad building was conclusively demonstrated in the construction of the Canadian Pacific. At one of its stops, 698 miles west of Omaha, in August 1868, Hell on Wheels assumed the dignity of a city, which was divided into 5 wards and christened Benton in honor of the senator who had taken such a conspicuous part in the fight on Whitney's project for a Pacific railroad. A mayor and full city government were elected, and ordinances to safeguard the public health were adopted. Being the end of the freight and passenger division and the beginning of the construction division, Benton was an exceedingly lively place. Twice a day enormous trains arrived and departed, and stages left for the end of the Central Pacific Track and other points in Utah, Montana, and Idaho. All goods for the front and for points on the plains and in the mountains had to be reshipped. The streets were beds of alkali dust 8 inches deep, which blinded and strangled all passers-by and floated away in dense, irritating clouds to settle in dirty white drifts on the wretched tents and shanties. There were 1 daily paper, 5 dance houses, and 23 saloons. The chief public resort was known as the Big Tent, a canvas structure 100 feet long and 40 feet wide, at one side of which was a gorgeous bar lavishly set forth with plate glass mirrors, cut glass goblets, glasses, and ice pitchers. Brass bands brayed continuously day and night, while Monte, Faro, Roulette, and Chuck-a-Luck games never closed. When railroad headquarters moved, Benton moved also. In a few weeks, not a shack was left standing. While the Union Pacific was struggling with uncompromising nature, bad Indians, and worse white men, the Central Pacific was also waging a great contest, though of a totally different character, against the Storm King of the Sierras. To build a railroad through mountains where the slope is 1 foot rise in each foot of distance, and where winter is an almost continuous series of snowstorms accompanied by high winds, is no trifling matter. To cross the Sierras, 15 tunnels were driven by the expenditure of $1 million worth of blasting powder, the longest being 1,659 feet. Work on the tunnels had been stopped entirely during the winter of 1865 to 1866. To avoid another such delay, engineer John R. Gillis kept 3 shifts of men at work day and night on the approaches to the tunnels in the summer of 1866. One night in the autumn, he stumbled over 2 miles of rough mountain trail and laid out the east end of tunnel number 12 by the light of a bonfire. Before midnight, the men were at work. When winter began, the headings were underground, so that the work could go on uninterruptedly, though it was necessary to dig snow tunnels 200 feet long to keep the entrances open. That winter there were 44 snowstorms, in some of which 10 feet of snow fell. As the usual temperature was about 32 degrees above zero, the snow was wet and heavy. During the storms, the wind blew so violently that the drifting snow hid a warehouse 30 feet from the cabin of the engineers. One man was lost in going a short distance in a straight line between rock walls and came in exhausted. In running lines outside, it was necessary to dig deep cuts and tunnels in the snow to get at the original transit points. Yet the tunnel headings met only 2 inches out of alignment. All summer, the Central Pacific was pushed on with a force of 10,000 men, principally Chinese, and 1,300 teams. By December 1st, 1867, all the tunnels were pierced, and trains were running across the summit to Truckee, 140 miles east of Sacramento. The spring of 1868 found the two companies on equal terms. While the Central Pacific had been crossing the Sierras, the Union Pacific had surmounted Evans Pass, the highest point on the line, at an elevation of 8,242 feet. Both had ample funds at last, and both were almost equally distant from Monument Point, at the head of Great Salt Lake, the Union Pacific being 522 miles away, and the Central Pacific 545 miles. As soon as the weather permitted, a construction campaign was begun which has never yet been equaled. From 20,000 to 25,000 men, and from 5,000 to 6,000 teams were employed, and from 500 to 600 tons of material were used daily. At one time, the Central Pacific had no fewer than 30 vessels loaded with supplies at sea on the long voyage of 19,000 miles from New York around the Horn to San Francisco. 25 sawmills around Truckee worked up timber for the use of the Central Pacific, while a dozen mills in the Black Hills and the Rocky Mountains did a similar work for the Union Pacific. Money was no object now. Speed, not economy, was the great desideratum. In their eagerness to earn as much as possible of the subsidy, the rival companies pushed their grades ahead until they overlapped more than 200 miles. In an attempt to get beyond Promontory Point, where there was a section of the most intricate alignment, heaviest grades, and sharpest curves on the entire line, the Union Pacific took the work out of the contractors' hands and put on day and night shifts to finish the job in a hurry. The result was that at the finish it cost $618,000 to move 178,000 cubic yards of material, whereas it had cost but $623,000 to move 800,000 yards under the contract system. The track layers followed the graders as closely as the delivery of material would permit. In 1867, the Union Pacific laid 240 miles of track. In 1868, 425 miles, and to May 10, 1869, when the tracks met, 125 miles. The Central Pacific laid 94 miles through the mountains in 1867, 363 miles in 1868, and 186 miles to May 10, 1869. General Jack S. Casement and his brother D.C. Casement directed the Union Pacific forces, which were handled like an army. In fact, the force on the Union Pacific was largely composed of former Army men. Operations partook somewhat of the nature of military maneuvers. The men marched to work to beat of drums, with outposts as a precaution against surprises by Indians. As expressed in one of the popular songs of the day, it was, "Then drill, my Paddies, drill. Drill, my heroes, drill. Drill all day, no sugar in your tay, working on the UP Railway." The engineers were the skirmishers, and the tie makers, of whom there were 1,500 employed in the mountains, were the advance guard. The ties had to be sent to the railroad in large wagon trains under strong military escort. 2,000 graders prepared the line. Back of these came the tie layers. Bridges were framed and the pieces numbered at the mills, ready to be put together immediately on reaching the front. 20 miles back of the tie layers were the construction trains, and still back of these, half a dozen miles, were the supply trains. Cars were loaded with the proper proportion of rails, chairs, bolts, and spikes, so that there should be no delay in putting down the iron. First of all was the boarding train of rough sleeping, kitchen, dining, and office cars, that the men might lose no time between their meals and their work. The boarding train would be pushed up to the end of the track, while a supply train was run up behind it and unloaded. Then the boarding train would be pulled back to allow the material to be loaded on little dump carts, which 2 horses would take to the front at a gallop. Arriving there, 4 men on each side would seize the rails, run forward, and drop them in place, in an average time of 30 seconds to the rail. A gang following them would half drive 8 spikes to the rail and place the bolts. A second gang drove home the spikes and put in the rest with an average of 3 blows of the sledge to each spike and tightened the nuts on the bolts. Lastly came the surfacing gang, which threw in the ballast, leveled the track, and tamped the ties in place. On many a day, the construction gangs of the two companies laid more miles of track than an ox team averaged in a day's travel on the old overland trail. Such performances as these attracted the attention of the newspapers in the East, which began to send their star correspondents to the front and to announce the number of miles of track laid each day, as baseball scores are announced nowadays. All this notoriety spurred the rival construction gangs to renewed exertions and made them boastful. One day the Union Pacific laid 6 miles of track. The Central Pacific thereupon laid 7 miles in one day. Upon hearing of this feat, the Union Pacific laid 7.5 miles. The Central Pacific authorities declared that their men could lay 10 miles in one working day if they wanted to. Vice President Durant of the Union Pacific offered to bet $10,000 that they couldn't do it. The money was covered, and April 29, 1869 was set as the day for the race. A large party of distinguished guests assembled to see the bet decided. 4,000 men, trained by the discipline of 4 years to the precision of a machine, began their mighty task on the stroke of 7 o'clock. Most of the working force was composed of Chinamen, but the Chinamen were not heavy enough to lay the rails. For this work, there were 8 stalwart Irishmen, whose names have been handed down to posterity: Michael Shea, Pat Joyce, Thomas Daly, Mike Kennedy, Fred McNamara, Ed Killeen, Mike Sullivan, and George Wyatt. They handled the rails at the rate of 1 minute 47.5 seconds to each 240 feet. In 6 hours, they had laid 8 miles of track, so they nailed a board with the word "Victory" on it to a stake and stopped for dinner on the boarding train, which was now run up. After the usual noon rest of 1 hour, work was resumed. At exactly 7 p.m., 10 miles and 200 feet of track had been laid. To do this required the bringing up and placing in position of 25,800 ties, 3,520 rails averaging 560 pounds each, 55,000 spikes, 7,040 plates, and 14,080 bolts, a total weight of 4,362,000 pounds. Durant acknowledged himself $10,000 poorer and returned to his own camp. Then, to prove that the job was well done, Campbell, the boarding boss, got on the locomotive and ran the heavy train back over the 10 miles of newly laid track in 40 minutes. 10 days after this great track-laying feat, which has never been equaled, all was ready for the driving of the last spike which would unite the two roads, making a continuous line from the Missouri River to San Francisco Bay. When the two roads met, the grades overlapped some 80 miles. The Union Pacific had wasted $1 million in its reckless race to seize the lion's share of the fat government subsidy. The Central Pacific was too crafty for its rival, for it had induced the Secretary of the Treasury to advance it 2/3 of the bond subsidy on its graded line to Echo Summit, 40 miles east of Ogden, before the track was completed to Promontory Point, while the Union Pacific had actually laid its rails to Ogden. There was a pretty row over this incident, which waxed so virulent that Congress interfered, but the companies concluded it would be the better part of discretion to compromise, which they did, and Congress ratified the agreement by a joint resolution which was adopted April 10, 1869. A space of 100 feet had been left between the ends of the two tracks on May 9, 1869. Early on the morning of the following day, Leland Stanford and his party arrived at the end of the Central Pacific track in a special train drawn by the locomotive Jupiter. Soon after, the Union Pacific official train, drawn by engine number 116, bringing Vice President Durant, Directors Dillon, Duff, and others, arrived. A strangely mixed crowd of Mormon saints, Mexicans, Indians, Chinese, Negroes, Irish laborers, army officers and their wives, Eastern bankers, bullwhackers, mule skinners, frontiersmen, and camp followers had assembled to watch the proceedings with varying degrees of interest, curiosity, or ennui. Mrs. S.W. Strobridge, wife of the Central Pacific Superintendent of Construction, who, by the enthusiastic interest she had taken in her husband's work, had earned the title of Heroine of the Central Pacific, was given a place of honor. After the Reverend Dr. Todd of Massachusetts had offered prayer, a Chinaman carefully smoothed the spot on which the last tie was to be laid. The tie, of California laurel, beautifully polished, was brought up by the two superintendents of construction, Strobridge of the Central and Reed of the Union Pacific. In the center of the tie was a silver plate bearing this inscription: "The last tie laid in the completion of the Pacific Railroad, May 10, 1869. A spike of gold, silver, and iron from Arizona and one of silver from Nevada were handed to Durant of the Union Pacific, who stood on the south side of the track. When he had driven these, Dr. Harkness handed the last spike of California gold and a silver sledge to Leland Stanford. Then at 12:45 p.m., the man who 6 years before, amid the jeers of a knot of street loafers in Sacramento, had tossed the first shovelful of sand turned in the building of the first Transcontinental Railroad, drove the last spike which completed that splendid achievement. The motley crew of 600 which saw the blows struck was but an insignificant part of the audience which participated in the ceremony. Through connections between the sledge and the telegraph wires, the whole nation heard the strokes that drove home the last spike. Cannon boomed, and bells rang out in response to those taps in every city in the land. At Chicago, there was a procession 4 miles long and an address by Vice President Colfax. At New York, the mayor ordered a salute of 100 guns, and a Te Deum was chanted in Trinity Church, while the chimes pealed forth the solemn notes of the doxology. San Francisco was delirious with joy. The celebration began there on May 8th and continued uninterruptedly until the night of the 10th. The buildings and the shipping in the harbor were decked with flags and bunting. Cannon boomed, bells rang, and whistles tooted for hours. There were speeches and processions, and everyone kept open house for all comers. The completion of the Pacific Railroads did more than anything else to put an end to organized outlawry in the West and to curb hostile Indians, who up to that time had cost the government $100,000 each to kill. It developed a traffic which earned for the Central Pacific alone in the first 3 months $1,703,000. Also, the construction of the Union Pacific netted its builders the neat profit of $16,710,432, or 27% on the cost. Finally, it created one of the greatest scandals this country has known when the people who had lacked the nerve to invest their money in the enterprise undertook to get even with the men who had risked and won. End of section 15. Section 16 of When Railroads Were New by Charles Frederick Carter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. Chapter 8, Through Tribulation by Rail, Part 1. If the uses of adversity are as sweet as the proverb makes them out to be, then the corporate existence of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company has been one long rapture. For if there is any conceivable form of trouble which can befall a railroad that has not beset the Santa Fe, no one who was ever connected with the company has been able to name it. Man and nature, separately and in combination, seem to have done their honest best to prevent the development of the road. The fact that in the face of all these difficulties, it has grown into a vast system of 10,000 miles, tapping the chief centers of traffic from the Great Lakes to the Gulf and the Pacific, is an eloquent tribute to the genius of its builders. The builders of the Santa Fe were a remarkable lot of men, as indeed they had need to be. Their talents covered a wide range, for the obstacles they had to overcome ran all the way from poverty and prejudice to military strategy. For, be it known, the Santa Fe and its adversary, the Denver and Rio Grande, enjoy the unique distinction of being the only railroads that ever levied war and maintained armies in the field. First of these builders, in point of ability as well as chronologically, was Colonel Cyrus K. Holliday, the dreamer, the enthusiast, who saw before any other man could the golden future of the great Southwest. Colonel Holiday was one of the founders of Topeka. As early as 1859, his vision of a transcontinental railroad following the old Santa Fe Trail into the Southwest took form. As a member of the Kansas Territorial Senate, he secured a charter for his project. That was the only easy step in the building of the Santa Fe. For the next 9 years, Colonel Holiday wore out his shoes, tramping from office to office of Eastern capitalists in quest of means to finance his vision. He reaped a rich harvest of rebuffs and ridicule, but no money. But he had the true spirit of the pioneer. That is, he never knew when he was defeated. He kept at it until, in 1867, George K. Beach of New York was induced to enter into a contract to build the entire road as then planned. But Beach lacked the courage to carry out the contract, so he assigned it to T.J. Peter of Cincinnati. Peter also developed alarming symptoms of cold feet when he went to Kansas to look the ground over, and realized from observation that the Southwest was then inhabited almost entirely by buffalo, prairie dogs, and Indians, whose principal industry was raising hair. On reflection, however, it occurred to Mr. Peter that a country which could support countless millions of buffalo was capable of supporting civilized men also. So the contracting firm of Dodge, Lord and Company of Cincinnati was organized, which built the first 1,000 miles of the road. 28 miles were built in 1869 between Topeka and Burlingame, Kansas. Once the beginning was made, the end of the track crept steadily westward. In 1863, Congress granted 3 million acres of land in Kansas to aid in the building of the Santa Fe Railway, which was to become the property of the road only on condition that it was completed to the Colorado line within 10 years. Congress was as free with land grants then as legislatures were with charters. Probably there never again will be towns as tough as those which punctuated the progress of the Santa Fe across Kansas. Law there was none, and human life was lightly esteemed. Yet, after all, the men killed were nearly always those who needed killing. Those who attended to their own business were usually permitted to do so in peace. At Newton, where the road crossed the Texas Cattle Trail, at Abilene, and at other points, it was considered an exquisite bit of humor for a party of drunken cowboys to ride their cayuses up and down the wooden sidewalks at full gallop, yelling at every jump, creating a deafening clatter, the chorus to which was a fusillade of revolver shots. If any man got in the way of the bullets, that was his affair. There were more saloons than anything else, and each saloon had a dance hall and a gambling outfit in connection. Everything was wide open, day, night, and Sunday. But for all-around cussedness, the palm must be awarded to Dodge City, which was founded in 1872 on the advent of the Santa Fe. This place was in the very heart of the buffalo country. The face of the earth fairly swarmed with the huge creatures. A good hunter could make $100 a day slaughtering them. Everyone had money to throw at the birds. A paper of pins, a shave, or a drink cost 25 cents. No smaller coin was recognized. But even in Dodge City there came, by and by, to be a limit to the excesses that could be committed with impunity. Murder was a trivial incident of everyday life for a time. But when Bill McGeechee began to swagger from barroom to barroom boasting, with loud oaths, that he had a jury in hell, meaning that he had sent a dozen men to the netherworld with his own pistol, the more respectable part of the community thought it would be a nice thing to send Bill before his jury. So there was a quiet little necktie party one evening, at which Bill was the star guest. After that, things began to simmer down in Dodge. The Santa Fe was fixed as a deadline, to the north of which bad men must not venture. On the south side, gamblers and all the scum of that wild civilization rioted for a long time afterward. On the north side, considerable pains were taken to ensure freedom from molestation for the peaceably inclined. A woman was treated with chivalry decidedly militant. If a drunken man accidentally jostled a woman, he was promptly knocked down by the nearest bystander, with a profane adjuration to be more polite in future. The first calaboose in Dodge was a well 15 feet deep into which drunks were lowered until they sobered off. Sometimes this unique prison contained half a dozen inmates. The Santa Fe Railway conducted its business at Dodge City in a boxcar for a long time, and it was a very flourishing business, too. Dozens of carloads of buffalo hides and meat were shipped out daily from the very beginning, and other dozens of carloads of merchandise came in to be distributed throughout the Southwest by the long wagon trains which crowded the streets. As an indication of the extent of the business done in the canvas and clapboard town at the end of the track, it may be noted that Charles Roth and Company of Dodge City, a few weeks after the town came into existence, ordered by wire 200 cases of baking powder from Long Brothers of Kansas City. The latter firm, thinking there must be some mistake, inquired if the Dodge people really meant 200 cases. Back the answer came, yes, double the order and rush it. The public sense of humor was even more fully developed at Dodge than elsewhere. Baiting tenderfeet was a very common form of diversion for a time. Many a snipe hunt was organized in which the credulous one from the east was inveigled out to a swamp to hold a bag all night, waiting for his newfound friends to drive the snipe into it, while these same friends slipped quietly back to their favorite barroom, where they went into ecstasies of mirth while they waited for the bag holder to realize that he had been sold. The favorite joke, though, was an Indian hunt. The tenderfoot would be induced to go out on a buffalo hunt with half a dozen local wits, who would ride by his side and fill his receptive mind with blood-curdling accounts of Indian atrocities until they caught sight of a party dressed in Indian finery which had ridden out ahead. The supposed Indians would ride toward the hunters, emitting the most frightful whoops of which they were capable. At this, the tenderfoot would turn and ride for his life back to the town, to the gratification of the jokers. At last, however, the jokers picked out the wrong tenderfoot. When the time came for him to exhibit abject fear, instead of carrying out as part of the program, he held his base and began pumping lead into the make-believe Indians as fast as his rifle would work. While none of the wounds he inflicted were fatal, they were numerous enough and serious enough to discourage that form of humor thereafter. At Dodge, there was an Irish justice of the peace named Flannery. 2 Irish section hands on the Santa Fe got into a quarrel. One attacked the other with a spike maul and was promptly killed by his intended victim with a shovel. Duly penitent, the survivor surrendered himself to the authorities. An investigation showed that he had acted in self-defense. Thereupon he was arraigned before Mr. Justice Flannery. "Guilty or not guilty?" he was asked. "Guilty, Your Honor." "Shut your damn mouth. You don't know what you're talking about. I discharge ye for want of evidence," roared the justice. The completion of the road to the Colorado line at the close of 1872 marked the end of the first period in the Santa Fe history. The great problem to be solved in this first period was to inspire capitalists with faith enough in the future of the West to advance money to build the road and earn the valuable land grant. The next hard nut to crack was to convert the land grants into cash, which was merely incidental to creating traffic that would support the road by peopling the wilderness. This difficult task fell to A.E. Tuzelen, who at the age of 33 was called to fill the position of general passenger agent, general freight agent, land commissioner, and a few other things. He was a terrific worker. Soon after he took hold, things began to happen in Kansas. Mr. Tuzelen was the originator of many of the modern methods of railroad development work. Booklets were prepared and distributed, large advertising contracts placed, and an army of land agents was organized. One of the most interesting features of this work was that furnished by C.B. Schmidt, who was appointed foreign immigration agent. Mr. Schmidt was the son of the architect to the King of Saxony, who had wandered out to Kansas and had taken up newspaper work. His first trip to secure immigrants was to Russia, after the Mennonites, who were something like the Quakers. The Russian government heard of Mr. Schmidt's mission and promptly sent a numerous delegation from the police department with a pressing invitation to him to get out and stay out. But by fast driving and night journeys, enlivened by some rather exciting adventures, he contrived to elude the police and do his work so well that he was followed to Kansas in 1875 by a first detachment of 1,900 Mennonites, who brought $2,250,000 in gold with them. The call of this entire body of men, women, and children in their picturesque costumes on the governor at Topeka is one of the spectacular incidents in the history of the state. The energy and originality displayed in this colonization work disposed of the entire land grant in a few years, at an average price of $4.71 an acre, with expenses and commissions averaging 84 cents an acre. Of course, government land tributary to the railroad was also settled at the same time, so that in the ordinary course of events, the fate of Cyrus K. Holliday and his co-laborers would have been abundantly justified in a heavy volume of traffic. But there were drawbacks which no man could foresee. One of these was the great grasshopper raid of 1874. No man who has never seen a grasshopper raid can form any conception of what it is like. For 3 days, the flight of the insects spread a haze over the sun like smoke from a forest fire. They settled down until they covered the face of the earth. They flew up in such countless swarms against the noses, eyes, ears, and bodies of horses that they ran away, and they covered the railroads so thick that the wheels ground them into a slimy pulp in which the drivers spun impotently around while trains stood still. What was more serious, the grasshoppers ate every green thing within 24 hours after their arrival, leaving the new settlers face to face with famine. Many colonists left the country, never to return. That grasshopper year was a severe blow to Kansas, and an even more serious one for the struggling Santa Fe Railway, which started from nowhere and also ended there. The earnings of the 508 miles in the grasshopper year were $2,462 a mile, but a worse setback was experienced in the drought of 1879 to 1880. Destitute settlers left the country by thousands, carried free by the railroads. Those who remained had to be supplied with free seed wheat and corn by the railroads. Railroad earnings went down like mercury in a blizzard. Under these pleasant conditions, Thomas Nickerson undertook, as president of the Santa Fe, the simple task of extending the road. He must have been a wonder, for under such discouraging circumstances, he raised the necessary money to push the road steadily to the westward for 6 years, from 1874 to 1880. Mr. Nickerson's genius was solely as a financier. Nevertheless, he was immensely popular with the men. He never felt it necessary to put on any frills. When he went out on a tour of inspection, he didn't need a private car. He just swung himself aboard the little red caboose at the tail end of a way freight, with his lunch wrapped in a newspaper, in his coat pocket, and chummed with the crew. Stories about these trips in the little red caboose reached the ears of the investing public and profoundly impressed all hearers with the rigid economy of the Nickerson regime, thus stimulating the drooping price of stock. The latter part of Mr. Nickerson's administration was not marked by that serene repose which is supposed to be agreeable to financiers. When the road got into Colorado, it also got into an entirely new set of difficulties. William B. Strong, a young man who had been brought up in the way he should go on the Burlington Road, was made vice president and general manager. Now, Mr. Strong was the antithesis of Mr. Nickerson in temperament, taste, and training. Strong was a cyclone which never ran down, to whom strife, difficulty, and discouragement were the breath of life. Whereas Nickerson maneuvered by the gentle arts of diplomacy, Strong greatly preferred, figuratively speaking, to knock his adversary down first and argue with him afterward. The result was that Nickerson was obliged to spend a good deal of time roosting on the safety valve of Strong's enthusiasm when he would have preferred a more congenial occupation, while Strong expended a great deal of nerve force in fretting because he was not permitted to tear the Rocky Mountains up by the roots. Events seemed to demonstrate that a judicious blending of these diverse temperaments and talents was exactly what was needed to work out the destiny of the Santa Fe. Unfortunately, the management erred at first regarding what that destiny was to be. The Santa Fe people had been under the impression that they were to have Colorado for their own. Leadville's palmy days were beginning, and in fact, the whole state held out a luring promise of rich traffic. But nature, most unfortunately, had created the Rocky Mountains without regard to the limitations of railroad engineering. There is only one way through the Front Range near enough to be of use to the Santa Fe, and that is a mere crack in the granite something less than 3,000 feet deep, with sides so straight up and down that standing at the bottom one can see the stars at noonday as from the bottom of a well. Through this crack roars a mountain torrent which becomes the Arkansas River. Several $1,000s had to be expended in blasting footholds in this granite fissure before the engineers could be sure they could find room to squeeze a line of rails through. The Santa Fe prepared to build through this tremendous chasm regardless of the fact that the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Company had been organized some years before to do this very thing and had made a survey through the canyon but had been prevented by their poverty from building. The Denver and Rio Grande then had less than 400 miles of narrow-gauge road in operation. At the same time, the Santa Fe prepared to continue on toward the Pacific coast by way of Raton Pass, which the Denver and Rio Grande also had planned to use in its business. It is a pretty well-established fact that two material bodies cannot occupy the same position in space at the same time. When the bodies which attempt this impossible feat happen to be as substantial as railroads, under the protection of numerous guards of determined Western men whose religion is to shoot before the other fellow does, interesting developments may be looked for. As a preliminary to the extension through New Mexico, Mr. Strong was sent to Santa Fe to get the necessary legislation and whatever financial aid could be obtained from the Mexicans as his first task after joining the Santa Fe Railroad at the close of 1877. On reaching the territorial capital, he found that the Southern Pacific had thoughtfully endeavored, a few days before, to save him the work and worry of building a railroad through the lonely mountains by securing the passage of a certain law. This law provided that a majority of any board of directors operating a railroad should be residents of the territory, that they must have 10% of the cost of construction on hand before beginning work, and there were other interesting details that would make it impossible for the Santa Fe to raise money to build 500 miles through that remote region. Moreover, the Mexican natives were decidedly hostile to the proposed American invasion. But the Southern Pacific forces had made a fatal error. They had neglected to insert in their measure a clause repealing the old law or providing that the new should take immediate effect. The old law was therefore still in force. With characteristic energy, Strong organized a corporation to build his line through the territory and prepared and secured the passage of an innocent little bill, relieving his new company from all the objectionable features of the new railroad law. This measure was signed by the governor before the leisurely hostiles awoke to what was going on. Strong hurried back to headquarters and, after much urging, secured permission to make the surveys in the spring. As this was in the last week of February, 1878, Strong interpreted spring as meaning that moment. He immediately sent a rush message to Chief Engineer A. Robinson, who, by the way, achieved the remarkable record of building every mile of the Santa Fe system not acquired by purchase to go to Raton Pass and take possession. When Mr. Robinson stepped on the Rio Grande train at Pueblo to go to El Morro, the nearest railroad point to Raton Pass, he found J.A. McMurtry, the chief engineer of the Rio Grande, on board. Each guessed the other's business. On reaching El Morro, McMurtry instantly set about organizing and arming his force, while Robinson hurried to Trinidad, 5 miles away, as fast as horseflesh could carry him. The Denver and Rio Grande Company in the beginning instituted the disastrous policy of avoiding established towns and building up towns of its own. This policy quite naturally embittered a good part of the people of the state and endangered the existence of the road. End of section 16. Section 17 of When Railroads Were New by Charles Frederick Carter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ted Lienhart. Chapter 8. through Tribulation by Rail, Part 2. Trinidad was an old town which had been passed by in favor of El Morro, a creation of the railroad. Consequently, Robinson had no difficulty in recruiting a little army with shovels and rifles, enthusiastically willing to thwart the Rio Grande Company and to shoot up its cohorts if opportunity offered. McMurtry, on the other hand, found it easy to gather a strong force of equally eager partisans of his own road at El Morro. Robinson's men proved to be the best sprinters, for they reached Raton Pass at 4 o'clock in the morning, just 30 minutes before the McMurtry forces appeared. There was a good deal of loud talk, but as neither leader was Western bred, they didn't know where to leave off talking and begin shooting. The baffled Rio Grande forces finally withdrew and left the Santa Fe in possession of the pass. It was by the narrow margin of 30 minutes, therefore, that the Santa Fe missed being cut off from the coast and left a mere local road to be gobbled up by a stronger system, for if McMurtry had reached the pass first, he would unquestionably have held it for the Rio Grande. The first car passed into New Mexico over Raton's summit, December 7, 1878, by means of a switchback 3 1/4 miles long, with 6 switches and maximum grades of 316 feet to the mile. A Baldwin Mogul, weighing 110,000 pounds, the largest locomotive ever built up to that time, was ordered especially to do the work on this switchback. A year later, a tunnel 2,000 feet long pierced the summit at an altitude of 7,622 feet, reducing the maximum grade on Raton Mountain to 185 feet. Even that was enough to make things interesting for the train crews before air brakes came into general use. That same season, the grading was completed to Las Vegas, 110 miles beyond. While the main line was being pushed over the Raton Mountains, a spectacular struggle was going on for possession of the Grand Canyon of the Arkansas. Strong began making arrangements early in the spring for a coup. Being in possession of the telegraph wires, the Rio Grande was able to get hold of cipher dispatches which revealed to them what was going forward. Strong, who was at El Morro, heard on the 19th of April, 1878, that General W.J. Palmer, president of the Rio Grande Company, had arranged to cut him out of the Grand Canyon. Accordingly, he wired to engineer William R. Morley, who was at La Junta, to take an engine and proceed with all possible speed to Pueblo, 63 miles away, and there take a Denver and Rio Grande train to Canyon City to organize a force with which he was to take possession of the Grand Canyon and hold it against the Rio Grande. Morley carried out his instructions until he got to Pueblo. No train to Canyon City being available, he tried to get a narrow-gauge locomotive on the Rio Grande to take him up, but he was refused. He immediately hunted up the best horse procurable in Pueblo and started late at night on the 40-mile ride to Canyon City. About the same time that he left Pueblo, a Rio Grande train also left that place, bearing a force of 100 men to take possession of the Grand Canyon for General Palmer. It was a pretty race between horse and locomotive. A narrow-gauge mountain locomotive has to turn its wheels over a good many times to cover a mile, and besides, the track being new and rough, the engineer was not trying to make speed records. Also, the Rio Grande commander didn't know Morley. It was an unequal race. The horse was good for a spurt, but a 40-mile run against a locomotive was too much. Toward the last, he failed under Morley's lash, and something more than a mile from Canyon City, he dropped dead. Without a moment's pause, Morley struck a dog trot and kept it up till he reached the office of the local company which had been organized to build the road for the Santa Fe. With all possible speed, he gathered a force of 150 men and started for the mouth of the canyon, 2 miles away, on the run. Precious little time was lost in this, for Canyon City was bitter against the Rio Grande for seeking to build a rival town nearby, and citizens were never very widely separated from their guns. Arriving at the mouth of the canyon, part of the force began digging wherever they could find any loose dirt. The construction of the Santa Fe Road through the Grand Canyon had begun. The rest selected nice cozy nooks behind bulletproof boulders, arranged their rifles and six-shooters so they would be real handy, and waited as if they were expecting someone. They didn't wait long. The Rio Grande people were so sure they had the advantage that they had not exhibited undue haste. Therefore, on a second momentous occasion, they arrived 30 minutes too late. Knowing only too well that the arrangements made for their reception were no idle bluff, the Rio Grande forces withdrew after a brief parley. Work was pushed on the grading with all possible dispatch. Strong was so delighted with Morley's achievement that he presented him with a repeating rifle elaborately mounted with gold. While making a survey for the Santa Fe near Guaymas, Mexico, sometime later, Morley attempted to take this rifle out of an ambulance muzzle foremost. The gun was discharged, killing him instantly. His name has been given to a station on the main line near the southern border of Colorado. Possession of the Grand Canyon was necessary to the existence of the Rio Grande. The company, therefore, never for a moment considered the possibility of giving up the struggle for it. A working force, guarded by a small army of fighting men, took possession of the canyon some distance above where Morley was at work, erected forts, and began the construction of the road. Thereupon, the Santa Fe obtained an injunction to restrain the Rio Grande forces from any further action, and also had Chief Engineer J.A. McMurtry and Treasurer R.F. Whitebreck of the Rio Grande arrested. Both sides continued to seize and fortify all available points in the canyon above and below. There were numerous arrests every day, and events were hurrying forward as speedily as possible to a bloody encounter when, on April 26th, the Rio Grande secured an injunction to stop the Santa Fe's work. 10 days later, the Rio Grande had the injunction proceedings transferred to the federal courts, alleging that it could not get justice in the local courts, which was strictly true, as the feeling against it at Canyon City was intense. Judge Hallett of the federal court enjoined both parties from doing anything in the canyon until their rights could be decided in the courts. Each party was placed under $20,000 bond. The matter was taken to the United States Supreme Court. For a while it looked as if the guns were to be put aside while the contest was fought to a finish with a less romantic checkbook. President Nickerson was continuing his achievements in raising money for construction. The system had grown to a total of 868 miles, and the earnings for 1878 were $3,950,868, while the Rio Grande was growing more hopelessly involved every day. General Palmer grew discouraged, and on the 19th of October, 1878, leased his road to the Santa Fe. Possession of the road was given at midnight, December 13th, 1878. This move by no means allayed the ill feeling between the rival companies. The Santa Fe's first act intensified the feeling, aroused the antagonism of the people of Colorado, and played into the hands of the Rio Grande Company. A part of the agreement under which the lease was made provided that the lessee should not discriminate against Denver. In defiance of this agreement, rates from Denver southward were immediately raised, which had the effect of cutting off Denver's jobbing trade and throwing it to Kansas City. In other words, the Santa Fe gave indications of an intention to wreck the Rio Grande Road, at least so the Rio Grande people said. Almost immediately after the lease was executed, the Rio Grande Company, alleging that the instrument had been broken in letter and spirit by the lessee within 24 hours after taking possession of the road, set about getting his property back again. General Palmer renewed his efforts to raise money for construction to Leadville, and at last was successful. As time went on, the Rio Grande people became exasperated to the fighting point. The sentiments of the management were cordially shared by its old employees in the train and engine service. W.W. Borst, superintendent for the Santa Fe, had to issue a circular admonishing his men to take orders from no one but the Santa Fe authorities. Armed detachments began to slip into the Grand Canyon and fortify advantageous positions in March 1879 in anticipation of the decision of the United States Supreme Court, which was expected soon. April 19th, Mr. Strong went to Denver to prepare for the war in the Grand Canyon, which seemed inevitable, and also for the impending legal struggle. Early in June 1879, the Rio Grande people procured from Judge Bowen at San Luis an order restoring the road to them. This order was placed in the hands of the sheriffs of the various counties to be served simultaneously all along the line at 6 o'clock in the morning of Wednesday, June 9th. The Rio Grande saw to it that the sheriffs had plenty of armed men to enforce the mandate of the court. The spectacular feature of the day was the raid of ex-Governor A.C. Hunt, an enthusiastic Rio Grande partisan who is described as a whirlwind of energy and indiscretion. He lived up to his characterization in a raid on that memorable 9th of June, which makes the exploits of Mosby's guerrillas seem tame. Starting from El Morro, bright and early, with a train carrying 200 armed men, he swept everything before him as he went up the line to Pueblo. Station agents were captured and taken on the train. There was a good deal of shooting, and at Cuchara, 2 Santa Fe men were reported killed and 2 wounded. At Denver, office doors were battered in with a cross-tie handled by husky section men. At most points, there was an easy victory for the Rio Grande. At Pueblo, things looked squally for a time. The Santa Fe had recruited a select band of fighting men at Dodge City under the command of Bat Masterson, who as marshal of that interesting town had achieved a reputation for skill and celerity in disposing of bad men who expressed a desire to shoot him up. This formidable force was posted in the roundhouse at Pueblo on that 9th of June. The Rio Grande Army did not attempt to take the fortress by storm, but threw up fortifications commanding it and prepared for a siege. Doubtless there would have been another Sebastopol if it had not been for R.F. Whitebreck, the practical-minded treasurer of the Rio Grande. On the theory that the dollar is mightier than the six-shooter, Mr. Whitebreck sent a flag of truce to the roundhouse. In due time he transacted a little private business with the valiant defenders of Pueblo, and the siege was ended. One last stronghold in Pueblo remained in the hands of the Santa Fe, and that was the dispatcher's office. This was taken late in the evening by an assault in which there was a great deal of shooting, but no list of killed and wounded. Ex-Governor Hunt's victorious army then made a dash upon Canyon City, where some Santa Fe fugitives had fled with 4 locomotives. The place was captured without resistance. On taking possession of the road, Mr. Strong had allowed the old Rio Grande men, with the exception of a few station agents, to retain their places. This may have been good railroad management, but it was mighty poor military strategy. When war broke out, the whole operating department not only became willing captives, but on reaching Colorado Springs, which was then headquarters of the Rio Grande, each crew received arms and ammunition to defend its train from recapture. Vanquished in war, Mr. Strong appealed to the United States Circuit Court at Denver, where Judges Miller and Hallett, on the 23rd of June, ordered the road restored to the lessee within 3 days. They added an emphatic warning that it would be well if the mandate of the court were obeyed, but intimated that legal proceedings might be begun to cancel the lease. Great was the wrath of the Rio Grande men over the order of restitution. Santa Fe engineers were pulled from their cabs and beaten. Threatening notices, decorated with skulls and crossbones, were sent to agents, brakemen, and everyone connected with the Santa Fe. A word of sympathy for the Santa Fe was a bid for a broken head. Blood flowed freely, and the authorities were powerless. Judge Hallett ended the disturbance by appointing Colonel L.C. Ellsworth receiver on the 24th of June, who managed the road until it was restored to the Rio Grande Company, which has remained in undisturbed possession ever since. During the war, the United States Supreme Court had rendered a decision in the contest for possession of the Grand Canyon favorable to the Rio Grande. The Santa Fe had not thought it worthwhile to wait for this little formality, and had rushed work with such energy that 20 miles of road had been completed, and the rest of the line to Leadville nearly all graded. To show that there was no hard feeling, the Rio Grande sent engineer DeRaymer to carry news of the decision to the Santa Fe construction gang. Mr. de Raymer, for company's sake, took 50 men with him on the journey to the end of the track, also 50 repeating rifles. Hunting up the Santa Fe engineer in charge, he ordered him to stop work instantly. By whose authority do you give that order? By the decision of the United States Supreme Court and these 50 men behind me. Work was stopped. Jay Gould, having through heavy purchases of Rio Grande stock acquired the right to act as mediator, a protocol was signed December 20th, 1879, which put an end to the Rio Grande War, the most extraordinary episode in the annals of the railroad. For months, each belligerent had maintained an army of 300 to 500 men in the field, had laid sieges, built fortifications, captured trains, cut telegraph wires, kidnapped public officials, purloined court seals, kept a whole state in a ferment, and done many other picturesque things which are now regarded as foreign to railroad operation. By the Treaty of Boston, signed February 11, 1880, all possibility of further hostilities was obviated. By the terms of the treaty, the lease was canceled, the receivership ended, all litigation was stopped, the line to Leadville became the property of the Rio Grande on payment of $1,400,000 to the Santa Fe, and the Rio Grande's projected line from Pueblo to St. Louis was abandoned. The Santa Fe had now grown to 1,181 miles, and its earnings in 1879 were $6,381,442. Having abandoned its Colorado plans, the Santa Fe was free to devote all its energies to building on to the Pacific. They were needed. While New Mexico is generally regarded as a desert, the face of the country shows unmistakably that it is visited by rainstorms of extreme violence. The engineers consulted old inhabitants at great length, studied the topography of the country, and constructed the road in accordance with the information thus obtained. But after they had built an impregnable culvert at one point to carry off the surplus waters, they would go out after a storm to find that not a drop of water had flowed through it, while some miles of track they had regarded as safe from the possibility of washout would be scattered promiscuously over the landscape for miles around. The Rio Grande River was also extremely troublesome. One day it would be on one side of the track, the next day on the other. As late as 1884, Superintendent George L. Sands and his men might be seen wading, swimming, and diving in efforts to find a section of main line over which trains had been running a few hours before. In 1880, the Santa Fe entered into an alliance with the St. Louis and San Francisco Railroad to build at once that part of the old Atlantic and Pacific line west from Albuquerque, and thus gain an entrance into California independent of the Central Pacific influence. As a precaution against this hostile influence, it was provided that the control of the road was to be in the hands of 3 trustees, 2 of whom were to be from Boston, where Santa Fe stock was chiefly owned, and that 7 of the 13 directors were to be Santa Fe men. Late in 1881, the expenditure of $16,500,000 was authorized, and the stockholders were jubilant over the prospective speedy completion of the road. Early in January, the astounding fact became known that Jay Gould and C.P. Huntington had purchased the St. Louis and San Francisco and were in a position to prevent the extension of the road. Gould wanted the Southwest for his own roads, and Huntington was interested in protecting his California monopoly. Both insisted that the Santa Fe should stop at the Colorado River. Other troubles followed thick and fast. Between 1885 and the beginning of 1888, the Missouri Pacific, a gold line, built 1,071 miles of road, and the Rock Island built 1,300 miles paralleling the Santa Fe. The payment of dividends ceased, the price of stock went down to almost nothing, and the road lost the confidence of shippers and the respect of competitors. The panic of 1893 put on the finishing touches. There was a receivership and a reorganization, and then prosperity. Cyrus K. Holliday lived to see his dream fulfilled. The road of which he was a director for 20 years, and which one of his cheerful fellow members of the board predicted would never pay operating expenses, now runs through trains over its own rails from Chicago to Denver, Galveston, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Its hoodoo has at last been laid. Its rifles have been traded for coupon scissors, and the competitors who once treated it with contumely now respectfully request the loan of its recipe for boosting net earnings. The hopes of its founders have been realized. End of section 17. Section 18 of When Railroads Were New by Charles Frederick Carter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ted Lienhart. Chapter 9. Romance of a Great Railroad. Part 1. To speak of the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway as a work sounds almost pedantic. Think of men toiling month after month through almost impenetrable forests, seeking a way across a mountain range, and when at last it seemed as if they must be forced to admit themselves defeated, being led by an eagle to the only pass in the entire range. Think of a vast wilderness turned as if by enchantment into a populous and thriving empire by the magic of the steel highway, built on the route the eagle revealed. Think of an enterprise which involved the expenditure of $140 million, which the breath of scandal never tarnished, which met every obligation when it was due, and many even before they were due, and which voluntarily pensioned those dependent upon the pioneers who lost their lives in its service. Think of the poor Scotch boy who began life in the desolation of the Labrador wilderness in the hardest of all services, that of the Hudson Bay Company, at a salary of $100 a year, winning vast wealth, a peerage, and about everything else that men prize, as one of the prime movers in this great enterprise. Think of the many other men who won wealth and titles and fame in executing this same magnificent conception, and then say if romance is not a more fitting term with which to characterize the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. The sheer audacity of the project when it was first broached was fascinating. Here was a colony, not an independent nation, a mere appanage of the British Crown, with fewer than 5 million inhabitants scattered in a narrow fringe along the eastern end of the boundary line between Canada and the United States, proposing to build a railroad 3,000 miles through an unknown wilderness to reach 4,000 or 5,000 other colonists in the lonely forests of the Pacific coast. But as the 4,000 would join the newly formed confederation on the Atlantic seaboard only on condition that they be provided with a railroad over which they could travel whenever their advice was needed by their 4 million brethren, there was nothing to do but build the road. The proposal to build the Canadian Pacific encountered the usual derision and the usual demonstrations that it could never be done, common to all great enterprises. But gradually the scheme took shape. As it seemed obvious that no private corporation would consider 3,000 miles of railroad through a wilderness a profitable investment, it was proposed to have the government build the road. Immediately, the Transcontinental Railroad became a political issue. The Conservative Party wanted the road built. The Liberals took the position that it would be a scandalous waste of public money, since such a road could never earn enough to pay for its axle grease. Here, then, was a subject for dissension abundantly capable of keeping the Dominion in a ferment for years, and it did it. Government after government went down in the effort to get the railroad underway. In March 1874, 2 years after the surveys had been instituted, the Liberals, more than ever appalled by the formidable undertaking, sent J.D. Edgar as envoy extraordinary to the unreasonable British Columbians to try to persuade them to be content with a wagon road across the mountains to be maintained at an annual expenditure of $1,500,000. Instead of receiving the Liberal envoy graciously and talking the matter over with him, the indignant British Columbians rushed their premier, George A. Waltham, straight to London to lay their grievances before the colonial secretary. It is said that the obstreperous Westerner so disturbed the equanimity of the colonial office that it has not recovered to this day. Naturally, this did not make friends of the Liberals, but in the end, the British Columbians and the Conservatives had their way. Each change of government contributed a little to the evolution of the magnificent project. Sandford Fleming, a Scotch engineer who had built the Intercolonial Railway, was engaged as chief engineer. In 1871, he made the preliminary arrangements for the surveys. As the whole territory, large enough to make a dozen states the size of Illinois, lying between Ottawa and the Pacific, was entirely uninhabited except by a few hundred persons around the silver mines near Port Arthur and a couple of thousand more at Winnipeg, and was practically unknown. This was a formidable undertaking. In July 1872, Fleming started from Montreal to take his first look at the country, and after traveling 3,300 miles through the wilderness in 90 days, arrived in Victoria October 11. In the following year, a great amount of surveying was accomplished. Although there were no bloodthirsty Indians dogging their footsteps with tireless cunning, watching for a chance to massacre without danger to themselves, the task of the pathfinders was not without its perils. Sometimes death, swift and terrible, overtook those who sought to solve the riddle of the wilderness. On August 7, 1871, Alexander Sinclair, William Matheson, and 5 Indians belonging to a surveying party assigned to the great woods north of Lake Superior were surrounded by forest fires and burned to death. Then there was Tom Clancy, who started alone to drag a load weighing 400 pounds, lashed to some poles, across the ice on an arm of Lake Huron, November 13, 1872. His cap, found floating on the water in a hole in the ice, showed only too plainly what became of him. May 20th of that same year, A. Hamilton, engineer in charge, and E.J.C. Abbott, transit man, in that same wild region went to a Hudson Bay Company post on Lake Temiskaming in a small canoe to settle an account and get G. Naut and G. Roche, chain and axemen, who had been laid up with scurvy. The post trader wanted them to take a larger canoe on their return trip, but they refused. None of the party was ever seen again, but their canoe was found floating bottom up. November 26 of that same disastrous year, the steamer Mary Ward was wrecked a few miles west of Collingwood, and 3 members of the survey who were on their way to a new field of operations were drowned. July 24, 1873, 3 men were drowned trying to get away from a camp on Whitefish Lake with a canoe load of supplies. The accident happened within 200 feet of shore while the whole camp was looking on, but no help could reach them in time. Most of the deaths in this preliminary work were from drowning, though a few died from the effects of exposure. Altogether, 34 lives were lost in those 7 years of adventurous toil and hardship. In each instance, the government paid 2 years' salary to the family of the dead man. Sandford Fleming saw to that, often paying the money first and consulting the government about it afterward. Camp equipment, instruments, and provisions usually had to be carried on men's backs, and supplies forwarded to parties in the field were transported by the same method, sometimes for hundreds of miles. It can readily be imagined, therefore, that camp life under such circumstances was not exactly luxurious. Indians rendered valuable assistance in the surveys. Sometimes the difficulties of travel in the trackless mountains were so great that the white men sent to deliver messages turned back while their Indian companions went on and accomplished what they were sent to do, even if they did get in more dead than alive. Surveying on the Pacific coast, where, owing to the wet climate, the forest growth is tropical in luxuriance, was particularly difficult. Marcus A. Smith, the resident engineer in charge of the work in British Columbia, set out early in the summer of 1872 to explore a possible route from Butte Inlet, which is far to the north of the location finally chosen. He was provided with both pack horses and canoes, but the ground was so covered with underbrush, matted together by aurelia, a creeper armed with long thorns which made festering wounds wherever it touched the flesh, and so obstructed by enormous fallen trees, that the party could only cover 5 miles the first day, and the men with the canoes could not do even that well, owing to the extreme crookedness of the inlet. As a result of 3 days' excessively hard work, The party advanced 18 miles. Then the horses were abandoned, and Indians were engaged to carry the supplies. The fallen trees were so large that it was necessary to cut steps in them to enable the men to climb over. But even this was nothing to the difficulties encountered in endeavoring to follow up the canyon of the Homathko River. Here there were cliffs of smooth granite rising vertically 200 feet from the boiling torrent below. It was necessary to drill holes in the rock for iron bars to support a line of timbers to get through this canyon. Chasms were bridged with single logs over which men had to crawl with heavy loads on their backs. The roar of the river and the boom of boulders carried along by the torrent, striking on the rocks in its bed, were so deafening that men a few feet apart could not hear each other shout. Work had to be directed by signs. This was too skookum for the Indians, so they resigned. The experience of engineer E.W. Jarvis, who late in the autumn of 1874 received orders to explore a pass through the Rocky Mountains, is a fair sample of the life of the engineers who searched out the route for the railroad through an unknown mountain wilderness. Jarvis left the mouth of the Kesnel River on the Pacific coast December 9, 1874, taking with him C.F. Hannington as assistant, Alec McDonald as dog driver, and an Indian boy as cook. They went first to Fort George, a Hudson Bay Company post, where they were to get dogs and supplies. On January 14, 1875, the expedition started. There were 3 white men, 3 Indians, and 3 dog teams of 4 dogs each, carrying provisions calculated to last 2 months. Some of the men and teams were to turn back after they had transported supplies well up into the mountains. Their outfit consisted of a pair of snowshoes and 1 pair of blankets to each man, with some extra moccasins and a piece of light cotton sheeting for a tent, canvas being too cumbersome to carry. This airy structure was to be their sole shelter, when they had any, throughout a winter in which the temperature averaged 39 degrees below zero for the season, and often dropped to 53 degrees below. The provisions were bacon, beans, flour, and tea for the men, and dried salmon for the dogs. They were to traverse an unexplored country many miles to the northward of the present line of the road. 2 men always had to go ahead to break a trail by packing down the snow with their snowshoes to enable the dogs to get through. Then came the lightest team, with the others following, with a driver to each. Lastly came Jarvis or Hannington to make a track survey of the route. Bearings were taken with a pocket compass. Distance was measured by pacing, 40 paces to the chain. The whole weary distance to Lake St. Anne, 50 miles above Edmonton, was measured in this manner. Noses and ears were frequently frozen in the intense cold. There was no comfort in camp, for when a roaring fire was built, the men only succeeded in roasting the side nearest the blaze, while the other side was rendered more susceptible to the cold. The dogs' toes were frozen so badly that it was necessary to make moccasins for them. On halting at noon on the 3rd day out, Marquis, the leader of one of the teams, lay down. He tried to rise, failed, gave a spasmodic wag of his tail, and rolled over dead. Upon examination, his legs were found to be frozen stiff to the shoulder. A thermometer exposed to the sun on top of his sled at the time registered 46 degrees below zero. 6 days after leaving Fort George, a cache made the previous summer was reached. Here Hannington turned back with 2 of his teams to bring up some dried fish for dog feed, while Jarvis, taking McDonald with him, went on up the North Fork of the Fraser to explore and break a track. 6 days later, the party reunited at the cache. 3 more teams from Fort George came up with provisions and fish, swelling the party to 8 men and 6 teams of dogs, part of which were to turn back at the summit. One day, McDonald went to a small brook which tumbled down a rock into the river to get a drink. The water of the brook had kept the river ice thin, so that when he stooped down to drink, he suddenly dropped beneath the ice. Fortunately, an Indian was near enough to grab him by the hair when he popped up to the surface. The only damage was a soaking in ice water when the temperature was 40 degrees below zero. In the next few days, nearly all the rest had a similar experience. Jarvis himself went down where the current was so swift that it caught his snowshoes and tugged at him so desperately that it required the united efforts of the entire party to drag him back to safety. Had he not been fortunate enough to throw his arms out and get a support on firm ice, he would have gone under for good and all. About the 1st of February, the snowstorms became almost continuous. The snow was so deep that when they shoveled down to the moss for a place to sleep, they could not see over the edge of the hole. In traveling, the snowshoes would sink into the snow a foot and come up with a small avalanche on the toes at each step. This caused many blisters and frequent attacks of mal de raquette, which is a combination of paralysis and cramp in the legs due to constant traveling on snowshoes. When night came, all hands were utterly exhausted. Finally, the valley took a sharp turn to the north. The stream divided, and the explorers were confronted by impassable barriers of rock. There was nothing for it but to return to the Forks and try the south branch of the Fraser. They reached the Forks February 12, where they rested a day. Then, sending 2 of the Indians with 2 teams back to Fort George, they set out to explore the south branch of the North Fork of the Fraser, the object being to find a pass by which the Smoky River, flowing southeast from the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains, could be reached. The woods here swarmed with moose and other game, but they had no time for hunting. The party was hardly out of sight of the Forks when the canyon closed in and the rocks overhung the trail so much that Hannington, who was in the lead, was obliged to take off his snowshoes and crawl on hands and knees for 50 yards, where he was halted by a waterfall. Turning back, he started a snowslide, which thundered down to the river, leaving him clinging to the rocks like a fly on a wall. However, he crawled back in safety. Going through the woods, they made a long portage, as every detour from the river was called. At the south end of the portage, the descent to the river was so steep that Jarvis, though he turned the sled on its side and sat on the bow as the only way of applying brakes, was thrown off, and team and sled plunged into the open water. Fortunately, no harm beyond breaking some traces was done. Hannington took a hitch around a tree with his trail rope and lowered his sled in splendid shape until the end of the rope was reached. When he tried to pass the rope to a tree lower down, the sled and team shot down the mountainside until they came to a sapling. The team went one side, the sled the other, bending the sapling down until the traces slid some 20 feet up its trunk, when it flew back, dangling the outfit in the air. A few blows with an axe ended this difficulty. On finally reaching the river, the sight of a clear sheet of ice caused the men to shout and the dogs to bark with joy at the prospect of a stretch of easy traveling. There was a general scamper to get to it. The first team promptly went down, for the ice was only 1/4 of an inch thick, having evidently just formed. The water happened to be only 2 feet deep, so the team was fished out safely. One evening they had just picked out a nice spot to camp when they were startled by the thunder of an avalanche above them. While they were discussing the chances of its passing near them, a boulder of perhaps 10 tons weight, loosened by the avalanche, came hurtling down the mountain straight toward them. By good luck, a bunch of large pines turned it aside just before it reached the group, or that particular survey would have ended right there. This valley, like the other, came to an abrupt end. By climbing 2,000 feet, a pass could be reached, so Jarvis decided to go on to Edmonton. The second morning, after crossing the divide to the eastern slope of the Rockies, they came suddenly to the brink of a fall 210 feet high. There was no sound of falling water to warn them. If the morning had been misty, as the mornings usually were, they must inevitably have walked over the edge of the abyss. As it was, they discovered later, on looking up from below, that the whole party had stood on a projecting ledge of ice and snow only 2 feet thick. A little farther on in this same canyon, and going down a precipitous descent, one of the sleds became unmanageable, and shooting down the mountain struck a log, crushing one of the dogs to death and splintering the sled. By the time they were fairly out of the mountains, the dogs were giving out. All 6 men had to go ahead and break track. Even then, the dogs had to wallow up to their bodies in snow. Their course in following the valley was northeast, instead of southeast, as it should have been if the stream they had struck was the Smoky River. They began to fear that they were following the Pease River toward Hudson Bay and starvation. Nearly every day the dismal howls of the dogs announced that another had dropped dead of hunger and exhaustion. It was now March 6, and their supplies were almost gone, and there was no game to be seen. So they cached 2 of the sleds and the instruments, and taking one sled, struck across country in the direction they thought Jasper House, a Hudson Bay Company post, lay. Each man carried his blankets and share of the provisions, leaving the worn-out dogs only 15 pounds of fish each to drag. It was now a scramble for life over an exceedingly rough country, with the certainty of death staring them in the face if they failed to find, within a short time, the one place where there was help. Every morning, one or more of the dogs was too weak to rise and had to be shot to cut his suffering short. One night the Indians gave up in despair and declared, with tears and great lamentation, that they were lost. It required all the eloquence of the white men to reassure them, particularly as the white men were by no means sure themselves that they would get out of the scrape. On March 20, the exhausted party stumbled upon Fiddle River Depot on Lac à Brûler, which had been established by the survey and left in charge of some Indians. Here they found that Jasper House had been abandoned, and that Lake St. Anne, the nearest Hudson Bay Company post, was 11 days' travel away. As the Indians were nearly out of provisions, and the dogs too exhausted to go any farther, Jarvis and his party were obliged to struggle on with their outfits on their backs. The last 3 days before reaching Lake St. Anne, they had to flounder through the snow without a morsel of food. They became so exhausted that at times they were unable to push one snowshoe before another, but stood still, feebly marking time. They finally reached the post in a dazed condition April 1st, after a journey of 900 miles on snowshoes in a temperature that averaged 39 degrees below zero for the 4 months they were out. There was a vast amount of work of this character to be done, to say nothing of the routes that proved to be hopeless upon first examination. Every foot of the long route through the mountains which was finally selected had to be gone over 6 times before the graders arrived. First, there was the exploration. Next came the exploratory survey, then the revised survey, the trial location, the location survey, and lastly, the revised location. 7 years these surveys lasted, with 20 to 25 parties in the field, winter and summer. In that time, the engineers examined 46,000 miles of territory, most of which had never before been seen by a white man, at a cost of $3,500,000. When at last their great task was done, it was well done, for they had found passes through the mountains 3,000 feet lower than those on any of the American lines. In only 3 places on the line were there heavy grades, and in each of these places they were compressed within 20 miles instead of being scattered over hundreds of miles, as on the American lines. Some idea of the difficulty of the work may be gathered from the fact that for a long time it seemed impossible to find a way across the Gold Range, the 3rd range of mountains from the plains, until Major Rogers one day followed an eagle which led him to the only practicable pass in the entire range. The news of this discovery seemed too good to be true. Chief Engineer Fleming would not believe it until he had been personally conducted through the pass by the triumphant Major Rogers. Afterwards, the board of directors voted a present of $5,000 to the major in recognition of the great service he had performed. A like reward was voted to Engineer Sykes, who laid out a loop by which some steep grades and heavy rock cuts were avoided. Good work by other engineers was rewarded by a number of lesser bonuses. Before the surveys were completed, the work of construction was begun. Instead of undertaking a continuous line, though, the Mackenzie government pursued a makeshift, haphazard policy of building short stretches of railroad to connect lakes and navigable rivers. That did not suit the people, and the Mackenzie administration gave place to Sir John Macdonald, who was for building a transcontinental railroad without any more nonsense. End of section 18. Section 19 of When Railroads Were New by Charles Frederick Carter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Lienhart. Chapter 9, Romance of a Great Railroad, Part 2. The MacDonald government accepted the offer of a syndicate composed of Donald Smith, governor of the Hudson Bay Company, who began life as an employee of the company in Labrador at a salary of $100 a year. George Stephen, his cousin, president of the Bank of Montreal, James J. Hill, with whom the two had been associated in the conversion of the abandoned streak of rust in the Minnesota woods into the vigorous and profitable St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railroad, Duncan McIntyre, the head of the Intercolonial Railway, who had been a Montreal merchant, R.B. Angus, and two other firms of bankers, one in London and the other in Paris. Under the terms of the contract, which was signed October 20th, 1880, the syndicate undertook to have a railroad in operation from Montreal to Vancouver 10 years from that date in consideration of $25 million cash, 25 million acres of land, and 712 miles of railroad in various stages of completion. No duty was to be levied on material imported, and the company was to be free from taxes and competition for 20 years. Construction was begun by the company the following spring, but only 165 miles were built that season. This was too slow for the syndicate, so they turned to the United States for help. W.C. Van Horn of Illinois, who had risen from telegraph operator to the presidency of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul, then the largest railroad system in the country, was engaged as general manager. An American firm, Langdon and Shepherd of St. Paul, was induced to undertake the contract for building the 670 miles from Flat Creek, which is 175 miles west of Winnipeg, to Calgary, and another American, James Ross, was installed by the contractors as general manager of construction. Then ensued the most spectacular bit of railroad building ever seen. March 11, 1882, the day the contract was signed, Langdon and Shepherd advertised for 3,000 men and 2,000 teams. 60 subcontractors were set to work on sections of 1 mile or more, according to their means and ability. By the time the grass was green, an army of 10,000 men was at work on the Great Prairie. The work was done on the English plan, that is, the construction was solid and substantial as it was possible to make it, and not a rough temporary track. It was heavy work, averaging 17,000 cubic yards per mile of earth removal across the prairies. As soon as the subcontractor finished his job, he moved forward 100 to 150 miles, where he began on another section. In another 6 weeks, he was pretty sure to hear the locomotive behind him. In advance of the track layers were bridge gangs, as large as could work to advantage, divided into day and night shifts. As every stick of timber had to be hauled from Rat Portage, 140 miles east of Winnipeg, the bridge builders could not work more than 8 or 10 miles ahead of the track layers. Timber was unloaded at night and hauled to the front so as not to interfere with other work. Where not a sign of preparation or a stick of timber could be seen one day, the next day would show 2 or 3 spans of a nicely finished bridge, and on the second day, trains would be running over it. Following the bridge builders came the track-laying gang, the most picturesque feature of railroad building. This gang consisted of 300 men and 35 teams, working in as perfect accord as a fine machine. Floods in Red River Valley, the only route over which supplies could come, delayed work so much that by the end of June, only 70 miles of track had been laid. But in the next 6 months, 349 miles were laid. Next year, 376 miles were laid, making a total for the syndicate's 3 years of 962 miles of main line and 66 miles of siding. The record month was July 1883, when 92 miles were laid. The biggest day's work, 6.38 miles of track, was done on July 28, 1883. That day, 2,120 rails weighing 604 tons were laid. To accomplish this feat required 12 men to unload rails, 12 to load them on dump cars, and 10 men, 5 on each side, to lay the rails in place. 2 distributors of angle bars and bolts handled 4,240 plates and 8,480 bolts. Following them, 15 bolters put in an average of 565 bolts each. 32 spikers with a nipper to each pair drove 63,000 spikes distributed by 4 peddlers. The lead and gauge spikers each drove 2,120 spikes with an average of 4 blows each, which required an average speed of 600 blows per hour for 14 hours. 16,000 ties were unloaded, loaded on wagons, and hauled to place by 32 men and 32 teams. On the grade, 8 men unloaded and distributed the ties. 4 others spaced them. 2 spaced the joint ties, while still another 2 men adjusted the misplaced ties immediately ahead of the leading spikers. 4 iron car boys and 2 horses hauled the iron to the front. The sidetrack gang put in a siding 2,000 feet long that day. To handle the commissariat for so large an army distributed over 150 miles of territory and constantly on the move was no small task. The horses required 1,600 bushels of oats, and the men 2 carloads of provisions a day, all of which had to be unloaded and hauled where it was needed. The men were fed on the best that money could buy. There were ham, bacon, corned beef, and spiced rolls from Milwaukee, while a butcher's outfit supplied the camps with fresh meat at least 3 times a week. There were blacksmiths, wagon and harness makers, shoemakers and tailors, a dispensary, and 5 doctors to be supplied and moved forward with their outfits every time the camp moved. In one important particular, the building of the Canadian Pacific was very different from the building of any other railroad in the wilderness. There was no rowdyism, no drunkenness, no gambling, no daily murder. As one of the delighted American subcontractors enthusiastically expressed it, this was due, quote, not to rough usage and old-fashioned Western lynch law, but to law made by the Queen and lived up to and enforced by her people. No liquor is allowed in the country, and under no pretext can any be smuggled in. There are none of the roughs and rowdies hanging around the camp so common on the other side of the line. There are no dance houses, no saloons, nothing to inflame and brutalize men and fleece them out of their money. When a man breaks the law here, justice is dealt out to him a heap quicker and in larger chunks than he has been accustomed to in the States, and he has a small show when the guilt is once fastened home. All trains are examined, and every arrival is known. If a man's reasons for being in camp are not satisfactory, his stay is very brief. For the first offense of bringing in liquor, there is a fine of $50 in costs, and the liquor is destroyed. Next time he pays $200 in heavier costs. The third time he gets a fine of $400, and what is worse, 6 months in a fort with the inconvenience of a ball and chain riveted to his leg. The moment a complaint is made of a dealer having liquor under any of its aliases, 3 or 4 mounted police make their appearance at Mr. Dealer's shanty, and if there is any truth in the complaint, he is provided with a conveyance to a fort, perhaps 100 miles off, where in the absence of friends and free from outside influence or interference, he takes his dose without fear or favoritism, and the medicine is generally a certain cure. I tell you there is a way to do it, and they are doing it right from the scratch." End quote. Langdon and Shepard reached the summit of the Rocky Mountains in December 1884. Their men were employed by another contracting firm, and the work went forward without interruption. While the Langdon and Shepard forces were making their remarkable dash toward the Rocky Mountains, some extraordinarily difficult work was being done along the northern shore of Lake Superior. To get through this wild country, 2,500,000 cubic yards of the hardest rock known to engineers, syenite and trap, had to be removed. To do this required the ceaseless efforts of 12,000 men and 2,000 teams working day and night, winter and summer, for 3 years. The task of supplying this great force the year round in a region so nearly inaccessible was one of extraordinary difficulty. The severe cold of winter, which greatly increased the difficulties of transportation, also acted as a tonic which so sharpened the appetites of the men that they consumed an average of 5 pounds of food a day, or a total of 420,000 pounds a week for all the camps. To supply current needs and to lay in a supply that would last through the 7 months of winter, when communication with the outer world was cut off, 12 steamers were kept busy while navigation was open. The northern shore of Lake Superior is so wild and rough that it was impracticable to build good wagon roads, so small boats had to be used whenever possible to distribute supplies. Michipicoten would have been the most convenient point for a central depot, but it was so exposed that the wharf and warehouse were twice washed away. Then the landing was moved to a point 4 miles west. In order to reach the line of the railroad, it was necessary to make a portage road 7 miles in length to a small lake 6.5 miles long, which was navigated by a steamboat that had to be built on the spot. At the farther end of this lake, the supplies were again transferred from a boat to wagons for a 16-mile haul over an extremely rough road, which had been made passable only by an immense expenditure of labor and dynamite. A second lake, 11 miles long, was navigated by another steamboat. Then came a stretch of 2.5 miles of exceedingly bad road to the third lake, which was traversed by still another steamboat that had to be built out in the heart of the wilderness. This third steamboat, by making a voyage of 26 miles, could land the supplies at a point from which they could be distributed to the camps. Every pound of provisions and other supplies required in building the road for 100 miles east and west from this last landing had to be handled through this laborious routine of 6 transfers from boat to wagon and wagon to boat again. In the winter, 300 dog teams were kept busy distributing supplies. A shelf 20 feet wide and 11 miles long had to be blasted through the living rock along the coast in one stretch of this difficult road. 5 tunnels were driven, and 10 rivers, one of them a stream 150 yards wide, had to be diverted from their natural courses through rock tunnels. This tremendous amount of blasting required 100 tons of dynamite a month for 15 months. It was all manufactured on the works with such care that not a single life was lost in the making or the handling. When it was all over, it was found that 90 miles of road had cost $2 million. The worst mile cost $750,000, but the work was so well done that the maximum grade was 52 feet to the mile, and there was no curve greater than 6 degrees. The first use to which this stretch of road was put was to transport troops west to help put down the Rio Rebellion in April 1885. The road not being completed, the soldiers were hauled over the unballasted track in construction trains and picked their way as best they could over the gap. Their unexpected appearance at the front did much to quell the uprising. On returning in the fall, the soldiers found sleeping and dining cars running regularly over as fine a roadbed as there was in the Dominion. Still another army of 6,000 men, principally Chinamen, were working eastward from Kamloops, 250 miles east of Vancouver, the end of the Pacific section of government-built road under contractor Onderdonk. But the Chinamen spent most of their time around fires in cold weather. Only white men were of any use when real hard work was to be done. Some wonderful engineering work was required to carry the road through the mountains. In the 62 miles from the summit of the Rocky Mountains to the valley of the Columbia River, the Kicking Horse River, which the line follows, falls 2,778 feet. The river had to be crossed 9 times, while there were 370,000 cubic feet of rock to be removed, exclusive of tunnel work. All drilling had to be done by hand because it was not possible to get machinery over the long and difficult trail. On the Pacific slope of the Selkirks, the descent is 2,350 feet and 42 miles. The Cascade Range was passed by following narrow ledges along the Fraser River through an endless succession of tunnels and over some of the highest timber trestles ever constructed. One of these was 296 feet high and 450 feet long. All food, material, and supplies had to be transported long distances through a wilderness, and finally through mountains which Sir Edwin Arnold declared surpassed the Alps, the Himalayas, and the Andes in magnificence, And it must not be forgotten that the more attractive a mountain is to the aesthete, the more troublesome it is to the engineer and to the humbler mortals upon whom devolves the necessary duty of getting bags of flour and sides of bacon over it. Some curious obstacles were encountered at various places which worried the engineers and cost the company money. For instance, 217 miles east of Winnipeg, the line crosses the Barclay Muskeg, which is the Indian name for bog. This muskeg is a huge basin filled to a depth of 200 feet with material dense enough to support the track, but which quivers like a bowl of jelly whenever a train strikes it. The surface is thrown into waves 5 or 6 inches high by the passage of a train. This jelly-like quivering causes the rails to creep, in some instances as much as 2 feet 4 inches under a single train. Track bolts were frequently sheared off by the creeping movement, and it was found necessary to station watchmen at the muskeg day and night with short pieces of rail to repair the gaps left by the creeping until the engineers could find a way to anchor the track securely. Again, in going down the western slope of the Rockies, the engineers wanted to tunnel a mountain spur, but the mountain proved to be of quicksand, which filled up the tunnel as soon as it was finished. After the third attempt, the engineers decided to go around. On the Thompson River, 200 miles east of Vancouver, irrigation on some mountain terraces had caused a series of extraordinary landslides before the railroad was built. In the largest of these, a mass of earth 160 acres in area and 400 feet in depth slid down into the river until it was stopped by the opposite mountain wall, damming the river to a height of 160 feet and forming a lake 12 miles long. As soon as the river rose to the height of the dam, it began flowing over the top, and in due time scoured out its bed again. There were a number of smaller slides in the same locality. When the railroad builders came along, they found to their astonishment that they could not make the track stay where they put it. The whole surface of the earth, lubricated by the continual seepage from the irrigating ditches, was steadily sliding toward the river over the slippery substratum of clay silt. One morning they found the track had moved toward the river 8 feet and had sunk 4 feet below grade during the night. Watchmen had to be stationed day and night to watch the wandering track until the engineers could find a way to outwit the elusive mountainside. Indeed, the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway was one long struggle with natural obstacles as formidable as they were unique. Like the pioneers who first grappled with the problems of the railroad, the engineers of the Canadian Pacific had no precedents to guide them, and not even any facts on which to base their plans, for the whole of the route lay through an unknown wilderness. It was evident, for example, that the precipitation in the Selkirk Mountains was enormous, and that snowslides or avalanches were frequent and appallingly destructive. In order to learn just how formidable these snowslides were, and to determine the position, character, and extent of snowsheds required to protect the line from them, parties of engineers, well provided with meteorological instruments, snowshoes, and dog trains, passed a winter in the mountains. The snowfall was found to be tremendous, amounting in one winter to an aggregate of 43 feet 6 inches. In a single storm of 6 days' duration, 8.5 feet of snow fell. Owing to the warm Chinook winds and winter rains, the snow in these mountains packs down into dense, heavy masses, a cubic foot of it weighing from 25 to 45 pounds. The slightest disturbance, such as a man or an animal walking across the lower edge of a steep slope, or even the vibrations of the atmosphere caused by talking in a loud voice, was sufficient to set a slide, sometimes amounting to 250,000 cubic yards, in motion. Usually the slides started by their own weight. With a crash and a roar, the great mass, weighing from 100,000 to 150,000 tons, would dart down the mountainside in a great white flash, sweeping trees, loose boulders weighing several tons, and everything else down to the solid granite of the mountain core with it. So great was the force of these slides that they would cross the valleys and be carried up the opposite slope 100 feet or so. The most remarkable effects were caused by the cyclones induced by the tremendous velocity of these enormous masses. These cyclones, extending for a distance of 100 yards on each side and in front, and for 100 feet above the slides, were called flurries. Huge trees, several feet in diameter, that happened to be caught in the vortex of these flurries would be uprooted. Others outside the vortex would be cut off as by a chain shot. A man who had the misfortune to be caught in a flurry was picked up and whirled and twisted spirally and finally dropped, a limp mass, without a bruise or break in skin or clothing, yet with every bone in his body broken or dislocated. The information gathered by the observers led to the building of 7 miles of snow sheds, in which 26 million feet of timber was used at a cost of $3 million to protect the tracks. The sheds were built of large square timbers, with their roofs on a level with the mountain slope, so they would offer the least possible resistance to the snow slides. As a further precaution, magazines of provisions, oil, and coal for the coaches were established at intervals of 10 or 12 miles throughout the Selkirks, so that if a train should have the misfortune to be detained by snow blockades, it would never be more than 6 miles from supplies. These magazines have proved, however, to be of little use except for such moral support as they may provide, for the engineers who planned the snow sheds did their work so skillfully that the Canadian Pacific has experienced even less trouble from snow blockades than lines farther south. Nor were the engineers and the contractors the only ones who were having a hard time building the Canadian Pacific. The men behind the engineers were ensconced in comfortable offices away back in Montreal, where they never had to give a thought to the chances of the next installment of bacon and beans getting through in time to keep them from starving to death. But they had to study very hard upon problems scarcely less vital. In 1884, when the great work was well along toward completion, there came a crisis that cost the officers and directors some sleepless nights, and very nearly swamped the undertaking with all hands involved in it. All the money obtained from the government and from sales of stock had been spent. Stephen, Smith, and the other members of the syndicate had pledged all their earthly possessions upon which money could be raised, and the Bank of Montreal was deeply involved. It should have been easy to raise money since so much of the road had been built, and the management had been energetic and economical, but it wasn't. The somewhat numerous class which had known all along that the road could never be built now had the public ear, and all attempts to raise money were viewed askance. The fate of the Dominion, as well as of the railroad company, hung in the balance for a time. As a last resort, the government was asked for a loan of $22,500,000. It hesitated. Public opinion was intensely wrought up, and the government could not count on its staunchest supporters. Finally, a secret loan was advanced by the government, and the crisis was passed. The syndicate proved itself worthy of this mark of confidence by repaying every dollar of all the government loans before they were due. All obstacles, natural and financial, were overcome at last, however, and on the 1st of November, 1885, a train bearing some of the directors and railroad officials left Montreal, while the eastern and western ends of the road were still several miles apart. When the train reached Craigellachie, 2,553 miles from Montreal and 351 miles from Vancouver, only one rail remained to be put in place in the track. The celebration attending the driving of the last spike on transcontinental lines across the border had always been an elaborate and expensive one. The admitted cost of the ceremony on the Northern Pacific was $175,000. The real cost was probably more, but in Canada they managed it differently. The last spike, said General Manager Van Horn, will be just as good an iron one as there is between Montreal and Vancouver. Anyone who wants to see it driven will have to pay full fare. Such inhospitable terms as these had the effect of limiting the party who witnessed that historic event to barely a dozen railroad officials and the workmen who finished the job. On November 7, 1885, Donald Smith, a Scotchman who had begun life in the wilderness at a salary of $100 a year, drove the last spike which completed the Canadian Pacific 5 years before the time specified in the contract. There was no speech-making, no banquet, no anything. When Smith had delivered the last blow, He threw down the spike maul, and then the little party went fishing. End of section 19. End of When Railroads Were New by Charles Frederick Carter.